The little girl never noticed the rain had soaked through her sneakers because she was too busy trying to keep her father's lunchbox dry beneath her jacket. 20 feet away, headlights crawled across the empty street while cold water rushed along the curb like a shallow river carrying leaves, paper cups, and forgotten things toward the storm drain. Then a woman's trembling voice drifted through the rain so softly that it almost disappeared before anyone else could hear it. "Please, don't leave me." Caleb Brooks stopped walking before he even realized he had made the choice. The city bus he had spent the last 10 hours repairing was already pulling away from the curb, and missing it meant another 45-minute walk home through the downpour. His daughter Naomi tugged gently on his sleeve, shivering beneath the oversized yellow raincoat that had once belonged to a cousin. "Dad," someone said something. Caleb nodded once. He had heard it too. Across the street, beneath the broken shelter of an old pedestrian underpass, a woman lay motionless against the concrete wall, rainwater gathering around her coat, as if the storm itself intended to erase every trace that she had ever been there. Cars rolled past without slowing. A cyclist glanced over before disappearing into the darkness. Two men hurried by with umbrellas, pretending not to see her at all. Caleb handed Naomi his lunchbox without saying a word. "Stay where you can see me." She obeyed immediately. She always did. As he crossed the flooded street, a delivery van blasted its horn, forcing him to step back from knee-high spray before reaching the woman. She looked to be in her late 60s. Her breathing was shallow but steady. One hand remained tightly closed around something hidden beneath her coat. Caleb removed his own jacket despite the freezing rain and carefully covered her shoulders. His shirt was soaked within seconds. He never looked around to see if anyone was watching. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered but never fully opened. He reached for his phone to call 911, just as another voice cut through the storm. "Don't touch her." A stranger standing beneath a nearby awning pointed directly at Caleb. "I saw you kneeling over her." Within moments, another pedestrian had already begun recording with a cell phone. Naomi watched from the sidewalk, clutching the dented lunchbox against her chest while uncertainty spread across her young face. The flashing lights of an approaching patrol car reflected across the wet pavement before Caleb could explain anything. One officer hurried toward him while another moved to secure the area. Caleb slowly lifted both hands away from the unconscious woman without a single word of protest. Then, just as the paramedics reached her side, the woman's fingers unexpectedly found Caleb's wrist with surprising strength. Her lips barely moved. Her whisper was almost lost beneath the pounding rain. "Promise me." Naomi must have the sketchbook before they find it. Caleb barely had time to process the woman's words before the paramedic gently loosened her grip from his wrist. "Sir, we need some room." He stepped back immediately, rain dripping from his sleeves while Naomi hurried across the sidewalk the moment an officer nodded that it was safe. She stood beside her father without speaking, wrapping both hands around his cold fingers as the ambulance crew carefully lifted the woman onto a stretcher. "Did she know my name?" Naomi whispered. Caleb looked down at her, his expression filled with the same confusion she felt. "I do not think so." But even as he answered, the question refused to leave his mind. She had spoken Naomi's name with absolute certainty. The officer who had first approached them lowered his notebook. "Do you know her?" "No, sir." "Have you ever seen her before tonight?" "Never." The officer studied Caleb for another moment before glancing toward the bystanders who were still holding up their phones. One insisted he had seen Caleb kneeling over the woman before anyone else arrived. Another claimed the older woman had already been unconscious. Their stories did not match. Neither did the timeline. Before anyone could sort through the confusion, one of the paramedics walked back carrying a damp leather sketchbook sealed inside a clear evidence bag. This was underneath her coat. She would not let go of it. Caleb immediately remembered the whisper. Naomi must have the sketchbook before they find it. But who were they? The paramedic looked at the officer. She repeated one sentence several times before losing consciousness again. She wanted this documented. The officer accepted the bag without opening it. Caleb felt something tighten inside his chest, not because of the sketchbook itself, but because the woman had clearly believed it mattered more than her own comfort. Naomi stared quietly through the plastic. "Dad," someone wrote on the cover. Caleb leaned closer. Beneath years of scratches and faded brown leather, faint silver letters caught the flashing patrol lights. They read, "If found, return only through the Whitmore Foundation archives." The officer frowned. Whitmore. Even the paramedic looked surprised. That name sounds familiar. Before anyone could say another word, a black sport utility vehicle rolled slowly to the curb across the street. Its headlights remained on, but no one stepped outside. The engine continued idling despite the pouring rain. Caleb noticed the driver watching the ambulance without moving. Seconds later, another identical vehicle appeared behind it. Neither displayed company markings. Neither approached to ask whether the woman was alive. They simply waited. Naomi squeezed her father's hand a little tighter. "Dad, are they waiting for her?" Caleb did not answer because he did not know. Then the first vehicle's headlights suddenly switched off at exactly the same moment the ambulance doors closed, and the officer holding the sketchbook received an urgent call over his radio. His expression changed instantly. He looked directly at Caleb before saying quietly, "Sir, I need you and your daughter to come with us. There is something about this woman you need to hear before anyone else does." The patrol car had barely reached the emergency entrance when another call came through the officer's radio. His eyes shifted from the windshield to Caleb in the rear seat. "The woman has regained consciousness for a few minutes. She is refusing to speak with anyone except the man who found her." Caleb exchanged a puzzled glance with Naomi. He had never seen the woman before that rainy night, yet somehow she trusted him more than the doctors surrounding her. Inside the hospital, the waiting area buzzed with quiet conversations, rolling stretchers, and exhausted nurses moving from room to room. A detective introduced herself as Rosa Alvarez and stopped Caleb before he reached the treatment wing. "Before you go in, I need to ask you something. The sketchbook belongs to a private foundation with a long history in this city. If that woman offers you money, property, or anything valuable, I need you to report it immediately." Caleb answered without hesitation. "I only want to know if she is going to be all right." Detective Alvarez studied his face for several seconds, almost expecting a different answer. She simply nodded and stepped aside. The hospital administrator then approached carrying a clipboard. "Mr. Brooks, there is one problem. Visiting hours are over, and your daughter cannot enter the intensive observation unit." Naomi looked down, trying to hide her disappointment. Caleb crouched beside her. "I promised we would stay together tonight." The easier choice would have been leaving Naomi with hospital security for a few minutes while he met the mysterious woman alone. Instead, he thanked the administrator politely and said, "Then I will wait until there is a solution that does not leave my daughter by herself." The administrator blinked with surprise. Detective Alvarez quietly watched the exchange without interrupting. 10 minutes later, one of the nurses returned with unexpected news. The patient had refused to answer any medical questions until both Caleb and Naomi were present. Hospital policy was quietly adjusted. As they entered the room, the older woman looked far weaker than before, yet her eyes immediately found Naomi. A faint smile crossed her face, as though she recognized someone she had expected for a very long time. Without asking for the sketchbook or mentioning the foundation, she slowly lifted her hand toward Caleb. "Thank you for keeping your promise." Caleb frowned gently. "We have never met." "No," she whispered, "but someone told me exactly what kind of father you would become." Naomi glanced at her father, confused by every word. Before Caleb could ask who had spoken about him, the heart monitor remained steady while the woman carefully reached beneath her blanket and removed a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. She pressed it into Caleb's palm. Detective Alvarez noticed the exchange through the glass window outside, but before she could enter, her phone rang. She answered, listened for only a few seconds, then looked through the window with unmistakable shock. "What do you mean the Whitmore Foundation was searching for Caleb Brooks before tonight?" Detective Alvarez ended the call without another word, but the concern on her face lingered long after she slipped her phone into her pocket. Before Caleb could ask what had happened, two well-dressed visitors entered the hospital corridor carrying official identification from the Whitmore Foundation. Neither of them looked relieved that Evelyn had survived. Instead, their first request was directed at the nurse. "Has anyone recovered a leather sketchbook or any personal belongings from Miss Whitmore?" The nurse answered honestly that everything had been secured by the police. The pair exchanged a glance that lasted only a second, yet it was enough to make Detective Alvarez quietly step between them and the patient's room. Inside, Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, gathering enough strength to speak again. Do not let them separate you from the key. Caleb instinctively looked at the small brass key resting in his hand. It seemed too ordinary to cause so much concern, yet everyone who learned about it reacted differently. Naomi noticed tiny engraved numbers near the base of the key that no one else had mentioned. Dad, those numbers look like a library code. Before Caleb could examine them more closely, a doctor entered and politely asked everyone to leave so Evelyn could rest. As they stepped into the hallway, one of the Foundation representatives approached Caleb with a calm smile. Mr. Brooks, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. Miss Whitmore was confused because of her condition. If she gave you anything, we can take responsibility for it. Caleb thanked him but kept his answer simple. She asked me to hold it. The smile faded almost instantly. You may not understand how important that object is. Caleb nodded respectfully. That is exactly why I cannot hand it to someone I do not know. Several people in the waiting area overheard the exchange. Some quietly admired his composure, while others began wondering whether the maintenance worker had stumbled into something far beyond his ordinary life. Detective Alvarez observed every reaction without revealing whose side she trusted. Minutes later, Naomi asked if they could finally go home because she still had school the next morning. Caleb agreed. He had already missed the last train and would lose several hours of work by morning. But leaving the key behind felt like breaking a promise he barely understood. As father and daughter reached the hospital parking garage, his phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. The caller identified himself as Daniel Pierce, Evelyn Whitmore's attorney. His voice remained calm but urgent. Mr. Brooks, wherever you are, do not return home tonight. Someone has already searched your apartment, and they were looking for exactly what Miss Whitmore placed in your hands. There is something you deserve to know, but if we are too late, the truth she protected for years may disappear before sunrise. Caleb did not waste another second. He thanked Daniel Pierce, ended the call, and led Naomi back inside the hospital instead of heading toward the parking garage. If someone had already entered their apartment, going home would only place his daughter in greater danger. Detective Alvarez was still speaking with hospital security when Caleb quietly told her everything the attorney had said. She did not dismiss the warning. Instead, she escorted them to a small family consultation room away from the crowded hallway. Less than 15 minutes later, Daniel Pierce arrived carrying a weathered document case that looked decades old. He apologized for the urgency before placing a single yellowed photograph on the table. Naomi immediately recognized the woman from the hospital, but there was something unexpected about the picture. Evelyn looked nearly 30 years younger, standing inside an art museum beside a display of children's paintings. In the corner of the photograph, almost hidden behind a wooden easel, stood a smiling little girl with braided hair. Who is she? Naomi asked softly. Daniel looked toward Caleb before answering. That child disappeared from the public record many years ago. Evelyn spent the rest of her life searching for what became of her family. Caleb studied the photograph more carefully. The girl's drawing pinned to the easel showed a lighthouse beneath a sky filled with blue birds. Naomi's eyes suddenly widened. Dad, that is almost exactly like the picture I drew for the city art contest last spring. Caleb remembered it immediately because it still hung on their refrigerator. The similarity was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Daniel reached into the document case again and removed a folded museum catalog. Inside, several pages had been marked with handwritten notes in Evelyn's careful script. Most referred to community art programs, scholarships, and anonymous donations supporting gifted children whose families struggled financially. One name appeared over and over again. Naomi Brooks. Caleb looked up in disbelief. She knew about my daughter before tonight? Daniel nodded slowly. For almost 3 years. Another question surfaced before the first one could settle. How had Evelyn quietly followed Naomi's progress without ever introducing herself? Detective Alvarez opened the leather sketchbook at last, carefully avoiding the damp pages. Between dozens of sketches rested a pressed maple leaf covering a handwritten envelope. The front contained only 4 words. For Caleb Brooks only. Daniel reached for the envelope, then hesitated. Evelyn instructed me never to open this unless she could no longer explain everything herself. Before anyone touched it, the consultation room door swung open. A nurse stood there, visibly shaken. Miss Whitmore is awake again. She swallowed nervously before finishing her sentence. She keeps repeating that there is almost no time left because the person everyone trusted is the very one who cannot be allowed to read that letter first. When Caleb entered Evelyn's room again, the first thing she did was point toward the envelope resting in Detective Alvarez's hands instead of looking at the doctors surrounding her. Her breathing remained weak, but her voice carried surprising certainty. "Read it now where everyone can hear." Daniel Pierce carefully broke the seal while the detective, 2 nurses, and the hospital administrator stood silently around the bed. The single handwritten page inside contained no legal language, no mention of money, and no accusation. Instead, Evelyn described how she had spent years anonymously visiting public school art exhibitions across Portland, searching for children whose talent was being overshadowed by financial hardship rather than lack of ability. She explained that she never selected winners through recommendations or influence. Every finalist had been observed quietly over several years. Caleb felt Naomi's hand tighten around his arm as Daniel reached the final paragraph. Evelyn wrote that one child's work had continued appearing in community exhibits despite worn supplies, borrowed paint, and homemade canvases. That child was Naomi Brooks. The room fell completely silent. Detective Alvarez slowly looked toward Naomi before opening the damp sketchbook again. Hidden inside the back cover was a second compartment that none of them had noticed earlier. It contained dozens of photographs taken over 3 years. Naomi painting during a neighborhood art fair. Naomi helping younger children clean brushes after a free workshop. Naomi smiling beside Caleb while carrying recycled cardboard that she planned to turn into canvases. None of the photographs had been taken secretly inside private places. Every image came from public events where Evelyn had quietly watched without introducing herself. Suddenly, the old woman's strange familiarity made sense. She had never been following Caleb. She had been protecting Naomi's dream from a respectful distance. Even Detective Alvarez's guarded expression softened. The Foundation representatives standing outside the room could no longer dismiss Caleb as someone chasing opportunity because every document showed the opposite. Neither he nor Naomi had ever known Evelyn existed. Caleb looked toward the hospital bed with visible emotion. "Why did you never tell us?" Evelyn managed a faint smile. "Because kindness changes when people expect a reward." Those simple words transformed every moment from the storm into something entirely different. Caleb had not rescued the right person because he recognized her importance. He had simply stopped because someone needed help. Yet one obstacle remained untouched. Daniel carefully unfolded another page hidden beneath the photographs. It contained a sealed appointment notice for the Whitmore Foundation board meeting scheduled the following morning. Beside the date, Evelyn had written one final instruction. "The key opens the archive. Only Caleb Brooks may unlock it before the board arrives. If he is prevented from entering, everything I protected will belong to the wrong hands." Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward the small brass key still resting in Caleb's palm as sunrise drew closer, and the most important decision of his life could no longer be postponed. Sunrise painted the upper windows of the Whitmore Foundation in pale gold as Caleb, Naomi, Daniel Pierce, and Detective Alvarez stepped through the front entrance together. The brass key remained in Caleb's pocket. Yet every step toward the archive seemed heavier than the last because none of them knew whether Evelyn had enough strength left to confirm what awaited inside. Members of the Foundation board were already gathering around the conference table, and the 2 representatives from the hospital greeted Daniel with carefully measured smiles that disappeared the moment they noticed Caleb beside him. One board member questioned why a maintenance technician had been invited into a restricted archive. Another insisted the meeting should proceed without delay because organizational business could not depend upon a stranger. Caleb never argued. He quietly offered the key to Daniel instead. "If this belongs to the Foundation, perhaps you should open it." Daniel looked at the key but gently folded Caleb's fingers back around it. The instructions were unmistakable. "If I ignore Evelyn's wishes now, everything she protected loses its meaning." That simple exchange changed the room more than any speech could have. Even those who doubted Caleb could not ignore the fact that he had been willing to surrender the only object everyone else seemed desperate to possess. Detective Alvarez noticed several board members exchanging uneasy glances, as though they suddenly realized the issue was no longer about ownership, but about trust. Naomi stood quietly beside her father, holding the old sketchbook against her chest. One elderly curator slowly approached her and smiled. "You have taken very good care of that." Naomi answered honestly. "It was never ours. We were only keeping a promise." The curator lowered his eyes, visibly moved by words no child had been coached to say. Daniel then unlocked the heavy archive door with the brass key. Inside, rows of carefully labeled cabinets stretched across the room, but only one small wooden chest displayed the same engraved numbers Naomi had discovered on the key. Caleb knelt and unlocked it without hesitation. Instead of deeds, jewelry, or financial records, the chest contained hundreds of handwritten evaluations, children's drawings, scholarship journals, and sealed recommendation letters prepared over decades. At the very top rested a single blue folder marked with Naomi's full name. Every board member stared in complete silence. The foundation had not been searching for hidden wealth. They had been searching for the evidence that proved Evelyn's final scholarship decision had already been made long before anyone attempted to influence it. One representative slowly lowered his head, realizing his earlier demands now appeared deeply misguided. Before Daniel could open Naomi's folder, his phone rang. He listened for several seconds before looking toward Caleb with an expression that carried both relief and urgency. "Evelyn is asking for all of you." He carefully placed the unopened folder back inside the chest. "She says the final decision cannot be read here, because there is one last truth only she can tell Naomi herself before anyone opens that file." By the time Caleb, Naomi, Daniel Pierce, and Detective Alvarez returned to the hospital, the morning sunlight had replaced the cold rain that had brought them together only hours before. Evelyn looked exhausted, yet when she saw Naomi carrying the weathered sketchbook with careful hands, peace settled across her face. She motioned for everyone except Naomi and Caleb to step closer. "Open the blue folder now," she whispered. Daniel carefully removed the documents while Naomi watched with nervous anticipation. The first pages contained years of handwritten evaluations praising Naomi's imagination, perseverance, and kindness toward other young artists rather than simply her talent. Evelyn had documented every occasion when Naomi shared supplies with classmates, encouraged children who doubted themselves, and thanked volunteers after community workshops. None of those moments had earned prizes or recognition at the time, yet every one had mattered to Evelyn. "Talent begins a painting," Evelyn said softly. "Character finishes it." Caleb lowered his eyes, overwhelmed that someone had quietly witnessed the values he had tried to teach without ever expecting anyone to notice. Daniel continued reading. The Foundation's highest scholarship had never been intended for the child with the most expensive training or the strongest connections. Evelyn had rewritten its purpose years earlier, so it would support young artists whose integrity matched their ability. Naomi met every requirement long before she knew the scholarship existed. Several board members standing quietly near the doorway exchanged emotional glances. Their assumptions about influence, status, and privilege dissolved as the truth unfolded through Evelyn's own words. Detective Alvarez gently closed the sketchbook, realizing the mystery had never centered on hidden wealth, but on protecting a promise that could not be purchased. Caleb looked toward Evelyn with sincere gratitude. "You trusted a stranger." She smiled faintly. "No, I trusted the father who stopped walking when everyone else kept going." The room fell silent. That single sentence carried more weight than any award or public speech. Naomi slowly reached for Evelyn's hand. "I will work hard enough to deserve everything you believed about me." Evelyn's eyes filled with quiet emotion. "You already have." Daniel then presented the official scholarship certificate, but before Naomi accepted it, she looked toward her father. Caleb nodded gently, reminding her without words to receive every blessing with humility. Naomi accepted the folder with both hands and immediately thanked every person in the room, from the doctors to the nurses who had cared for Evelyn through the night. The simple gesture brought unexpected smiles across weary faces. Even the Foundation representatives who had questioned Caleb earlier stepped forward to apologize for judging him before knowing the truth. Caleb accepted their apology without hesitation, asking only that they honor Evelyn's wishes. As everyone prepared to leave the room and allow Evelyn to rest, she quietly pointed once more toward the sketchbook resting against Naomi's chair. "There is one last page," she whispered. "I saved it for the day your own story truly begins. 1 year later, the first thing visitors noticed inside the Portland Community Arts Gallery was not the largest painting on the wall, but a simple yellow raincoat displayed inside a small glass case near the entrance. Beneath it rested a handwritten card that read, "Kindness often arrives before anyone knows why it matters." Few people understood its meaning, but Caleb and Naomi paused there every time they visited. The old lunchbox that Naomi had once struggled to keep dry on that stormy night now sat on a shelf in their home, no longer because it was valuable, but because it reminded them that ordinary moments sometimes carried extraordinary beginnings. Naomi's scholarship had opened doors that once felt impossible, yet nothing about her heart had changed. She still volunteered at neighborhood art programs every Saturday, helping younger children mix paint, clean brushes, and believe in themselves before they believed in their own drawings. Whenever reporters asked how she became one of the city's most promising young artists, she always smiled before pointing quietly toward her father standing somewhere behind the crowd. Caleb never stepped onto the stage unless someone invited him. He continued working as a maintenance technician, greeting passengers with the same quiet respect he had always shown, as though nothing remarkable had happened. But people who recognized him from the foundation ceremony often thanked him for something far greater than rescuing a stranger. They thanked him for reminding them that character is revealed long before recognition ever arrives. The Whitmore Foundation officially renamed its youth scholarship in Evelyn's honor and permanently adopted the evaluation principles she had protected for so many years. Recommendations based on influence disappeared. Community service, perseverance, and generosity became essential parts of every selection. Daniel Pierce often said the foundation had not merely changed its scholarship. It had rediscovered its purpose. Detective Alvarez occasionally stopped by Naomi's exhibitions, never empty-handed. She always brought one sketchbook for a child who could not afford one, quietly continuing the tradition Evelyn had begun decades earlier. On the evening of Naomi's first public exhibition, she finally opened the last page Evelyn had asked her to save. Instead of instructions or another secret, there was only a blank sheet with one sentence written across the bottom. The rest of this story belongs to the hands that choose kindness first. Naomi smiled through grateful tears before placing her first completed painting on that final page's frame. It showed a father crossing a rain-soaked street while a little girl waited with quiet faith, trusting he would always stop for someone in need. Caleb looked at the painting for a long moment before gently taking Naomi's hand. Just as he had on the night, everything changed. Neither of them spoke because they no longer needed words to understand what that moment had become. Outside the gallery, a light rain began to fall again, but this time it no longer felt cold. It felt like a promise that one simple act of compassion could continue echoing through lives they would never even meet. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.